What if the reason you haven't built that project, left that dead-end role, or reached your full potential isn't because you lack discipline, but because staying unfulfilled is the only thing protecting your ego from being completely destroyed? Think about the goal you've been putting off for months. You tell yourself you're tired, undisciplined, or just need better time management. Here is the brutal truth. As long as you don't try, your potential remains infinite. You get to preserve the comforting fantasy that you could be extraordinary if you just applied yourself. But the moment you go all in and fail, the fantasy dies, and you have to face the terrifying possibility that your absolute best isn't good enough. Your chronic procrastination is not a character flaw. It is an unconscious survival strategy designed to protect your identity at the cost of your future. Modern culture has conditioned us to view chronic procrastination, distraction, and hesitation through a moral lens. We label it laziness, apathy, or a catastrophic deficit of willpower. We buy planners, download productivity apps, and consume endless motivational content, only to find ourselves frozen in the exact same spot 48 hours later. In clinical cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary psychology, laziness does not exist as a biological state. What we mistakenly diagnose as laziness is actually an acute, hardwired threat avoidance response orchestrated by your autonomic nervous system. Your brain does not distinguish between a physical predator threatening your biological survival and a psychological failure threatening your social status, identity coherence, and self-worth. When a task carries the unconscious risk of inadequacy, rejection, or public exposure, your limbic system registers that task as a lethal hazard. To keep you safe from psychological annihilation, your nervous system triggers a micro-freeze response. It downregulates dopamine transmission to the prefrontal cortex, floods your system with low-grade cortisol, and hijacks your attention toward low-stakes, immediate comfort. You aren't avoiding the work. You are avoiding the catastrophic emotional verdict that failure might deliver on your value as a human being. This master-level deep dive deconstructs the neurobiological and psychological machinery behind task paralysis. Grounded in neurobiology, behavioral economics, and self-worth preservation theory, this breakdown reveals why your mind weaponizes hesitation and provides the definitive psychological protocol to disarm the threat response and unlock uninhibited action. When you sit down at your desk to tackle a high-stakes project, writing a manuscript, applying for a demanding job, or launching a new venture, you rarely experience your resistance as conscious fear. You do not feel like someone running from a fire. Instead, you feel a sudden, heavy wave of physical fatigue. Your thoughts turn fuzzy and scattered. You suddenly decide that your desk needs to be reorganized, your inbox needs to be cleared, or that you need a quick snack before you can begin. Within 10 minutes, you are scrolling through your phone, feeling a mixture of immediate relief and lingering guilt. Society looks at this behavior and applies a moral judgment. You are lazy, undisciplined, or unfocused. Your biology tells an entirely different story. What you are experiencing in that moment is not a failure of character. It is an acute, hardwired survival response triggered deep within the architecture of your nervous system. In the language of clinical neuroscience, you are not avoiding work. You are caught in the crossfire of an internal war between two distinct brain systems fighting for control of your behavior. The brain in conflict. The architect versus the guard. To understand task paralysis, you have to look at the structural division inside your skull. Human decision-making is largely governed by a delicate balance between two opposing regions. The prefrontal cortex, the ambitious architect. Located directly behind your forehead, this is the most evolutionarily advanced part of your brain. It is responsible for abstract thought, long-term strategic planning, impulse control, and working memory. When you set a goal to write a book or learn a complex skill, it is your prefrontal cortex doing the heavy lifting. It can visualize a rewarding future, months or years down the line, and calculate the steps required to get there. The amygdala and limbic system, the ancient security guard. Deep beneath the cerebral cortex lies the limbic complex, an ancient survival engine developed over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The amygdala does not care about your 5-year career goals, your creative aspirations, or your social potential. Its primary mission is immediate physical survival, threat detection, and energy conservation. In an ideal state, the prefrontal cortex acts as the CEO, directing your energy toward constructive goals, while the amygdala stays quiet until a genuine physical threat appears. When you attach massive emotional stakes to a task, this hierarchy collapses. Why the brain equates failure with physical danger? The ancient circuitry of your brain developed during hunter-gatherer eras, where social standing and tribal belonging were matters of literal life and death. If an early human was cast out of the tribe due to perceived incompetence, failure, or weakness, their chances of survival dropped to zero. Because of this evolutionary heritage, your nervous system never evolved a separate threat detection system for abstract psychological risks. When you contemplate starting a project where you might fall short, produce mediocre work, or be judged negatively by your peers, your brain registers that scenario as a potential threat of social rejection. To your ancient limbic circuitry, the risk of looking foolish, feeling inadequate, or being rejected carries the exact same emotional weight as being abandoned by your tribe on the open savanna. The moment this psychological threat is flagged, the amygdala fires an alarm. It signals the autonomic nervous system that you are in danger, triggering a biological cascade that actively suppresses the very brain regions you need to get the work done. The neural lockout mechanism. When the amygdala sounds the alarm, it does not negotiate with the prefrontal cortex. It initiates a physiological takeover, blood flow redistribution. Resources and oxygenated blood are redirected away from the analytical, higher reasoning areas of the brain and channeled toward the survival centers that govern immediate action or retreat. Dopamine throttling. Dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, focus, and drive toward a goal. When the brain senses an active threat, it cuts off dopamine pathways leading to the complex, high-effort task. Working on the project suddenly feels repulsive, impossible, and exhausting. Stress hormone surges. Low-grade cortisol and adrenaline are released into your system. This creates that familiar internal restlessness, a physical discomfort that makes sitting still and focusing feel unbearable. You do not lose the intellectual ability to do the work. Rather, your brain deliberately locks you out of the command center to force you away from the perceived danger. Your sudden urge to check your phone or clean the kitchen is not a random distraction. It is a displacement activity. Your brain is desperately looking for any low-stakes, safe behavior that can deliver a small hit of relief to lower your stress hormones and calm the internal alarm. The brain's energy conservation budget. There is an additional biological layer to this resistance, the strict energy budget of the human body. Your brain represents only about 2% of your total body weight, yet it consumes more than 20% of your daily resting metabolic energy. Deep focus, critical thinking, and creative problem solving are among the most metabolically expensive activities a human being can perform. Throughout evolutionary history, energy was scarce, and starvation was a constant possibility. As a result, the brain developed a strict conservation program. Never expend high amounts of energy unless there is a high certainty of a tangible, immediate reward. When you sit down to work on a difficult, ambitious project, you are demanding a massive investment of glucose and metabolic energy for an outcome that is uncertain, delayed, and fraught with potential failure. Your limbic system looks at that equation and makes a rapid biological calculation. Spending precious energy on a task with zero guaranteed immediate return and a high risk of emotional pain is a dangerous bet. The brain flips its safety switch to prevent what it views as a wasteful, high-risk drain of your internal resources. Reframing the paralysis. Understanding this neurobiology changes the entire conversation around procrastination. You are not fighting a lack of moral willpower. You are fighting a hypervigilant nervous system that is trying to protect you from an existential threat you never realized you were signaling. Every time you call yourself lazy, you add another layer of shame and stress to the system, which only convinces your amygdala that the environment is even more hostile, locking the freeze response in place even tighter. To break task paralysis, you cannot simply demand more discipline from an exhausted nervous system. You have to learn how to speak the biological language of safety to your own brain. The moment you understand that your resistance is a biological defense mechanism rather than a character flaw, the shame evaporates. You stop treating yourself like a broken machine that needs to be punished, and you begin the real work of disarming the threat so that your mind can do what it was always designed to do: create, build, and move forward without fear. Most people would rather be viewed as careless, distracted, or rebellious than be exposed as fundamentally incapable. This uncomfortable truth lies at the heart of why we stall on the things that matter most to us. When you understand this principle, chronic procrastination stops looking like a mysterious defect of character and reveals itself as a calculated defense mechanism designed to protect your most fragile internal asset, your self-worth. The architecture of this defense was mapped by educational psychologist Martin Covington through what is known as self-worth theory. Covington spent decades investigating why capable individuals deliberately sabotage their own progress in academic, creative, and professional settings. His conclusion was striking. Human beings in achievement-oriented cultures are not driven solely by the desire to succeed. They are driven by an even stronger, more urgent compulsion to avoid being judged as lacking in basic competence. The flawed arithmetic of value. From an early age, modern society conditions us to accept a destructive internal equation. We are taught that our value as a person depends on our ability, and that our ability is measured strictly by our performance. When you internalize this belief, every high-stakes task ceases to be a practical challenge and turns into an existential courtroom. Writing an article is no longer just putting words on a page. It is a public trial on your intellect. Launching a business is no longer an experiment in market demand. It is a definitive test of your leadership and capability. Under this psychological pressure, the stakes become unbearably high. If your performance represents your core ability, and your ability determines your worth as a human being, then a mediocre outcome or a public failure is not simply a setback. It is a devastating verdict that declares you fundamentally inadequate. Your subconscious mind recognizes this threat immediately and takes extreme measures to prevent that verdict from ever being delivered. Procrastination as an ego insurance policy. To understand how procrastination protects you, you have to look at the relationship between effort and vulnerability. Imagine you decide to give a project your absolute best. You wake up early, eliminate every distraction, invest months of deep focus, and put your whole heart and mind into the work. You submit the final product, and the world responds with indifference, rejection, or harsh criticism. In that scenario, you have nowhere left to hide. You gave 100% of your energy and intelligence, and it still was not enough. You are forced to look in the mirror and confront the agonizing thought that your highest potential falls short. That is a psychological wound that can take years to heal. Now consider the alternative scenario that your subconscious routinely engineers. You put off the project until the final 48 hours before the deadline. You work in a panicked frenzy, running on adrenaline and lack of sleep. You submit a rushed, compromised version of the work. If the project fails or receives a mediocre review, your ego remains completely safe. You have a built-in psychological buffer. You can tell your peers, your boss, and most importantly yourself, I didn't actually fail. I just threw that together at 2 in the morning. If I had actually had 3 weeks of uninterrupted time, it would have been extraordinary. This is the hidden genius of self-handicapping. By intentionally withholding your full effort, you create plausible deniability. You sever the link between your performance and your true ability, ensuring that your raw competence is never actually put on trial. The double payoff of delay. Self-handicapping does not just protect you in the event of failure. It also offers a massive psychological bonus if you happen to succeed. When you procrastinate until the 11th hour and still manage to deliver something acceptable, your ego receives a double reward. Not only did you avoid exposure, but you also convinced yourself that you possess extraordinary natural brilliance. You tell yourself that if you can achieve an acceptable result with only a fraction of your effort, your full, untapped capacity must be truly exceptional. This dynamic creates a powerful addiction to the high-wire act of delay. It turns ordinary work into a dramatic rescue mission where you get to play the hero surviving against the clock. It shields your deepest abilities from being tested under real, sustained conditions. It allows you to maintain the comforting fantasy of your own genius without ever having to risk that fantasy against the friction of reality. Procrastination becomes a comfortable holding cell where your potential remains infinite because it is never tested. The mask of covert perfectionism. Many chronic procrastinators scoff at the idea that they might be perfectionists. They point to their disorganized rooms, neglected to-do lists, and unfinished drafts as proof that they have low standards. This misunderstanding stems from treating perfectionism as a standard of high quality, when it is actually a strategy of psychological armor. Adaptive striving is focused on the joy of mastery, where mistakes are seen as normal data points along the way. Covert perfectionism, by contrast, is rooted entirely in the terror of shame. It operates on a rigid, all-or-nothing mindset. If an essay cannot be profound from the very first sentence, starting the draft feels terrifying. If a fitness routine cannot be followed flawlessly 7 days a week, going for a short walk feels pointless. If a new creative project might look amateurish during its early stages, opening the blank file triggers an overwhelming urge to run away. The covert perfectionist would rather achieve a deliberate 0 than produce a visible 7 out of 10. A 0 can easily be blamed on bad timing, lack of motivation, or a chaotic schedule. A 7 out of 10, however, represents your honest, visible effort, and to a fragile ego, being seen as merely decent feels far worse than being seen as lazy. The cost of the safe harbor. The tragedy of Covington's self-worth preservation theory is that the very mechanism keeping you emotionally safe is also quietly dismantling your life. Every time you rely on procrastination to protect your ego, you pay a hidden price. You trade long-term fulfillment, genuine mastery, and real-world impact for the temporary relief of avoiding judgment. You spend years living in the theoretical realm of what you could do if you ever tried, while watching less talented, more courageous people build real things out in the open. Your potential is not meant to be kept in a vault, pristine and untouched by reality. Untested potential does not feed your life. It only feeds your pride while keeping you small. Breaking free from this cycle does not require you to become more ruthless with your schedule or punish yourself for every delay. It requires you to make a fundamental, compassionate shift in identity. You must separate your basic human value from the outcome of your work. The moment you realize that an imperfect draft, a failed launch, or a clumsy first attempt does not define your worth as a human being, the threat evaporates. The armor of procrastination becomes unnecessary, and you finally grant yourself permission to step into the arena, risk the mess of learning, and find out what you are truly capable of creating. When we imagine someone avoiding work, we usually picture classic sloth, someone lying on a couch, staring at a ceiling, completely detached from ambition. In reality, a brain terrified of failure rarely looks inactive. More often than not, it looks remarkably busy. Because your nervous system wants to avoid the existential danger of falling short while simultaneously escaping the guilt of doing nothing, it develops sophisticated camouflage. It invents alternative activities that mimic the feeling of hard work while steering you completely clear of any real vulnerability. This is the behavioral symptom matrix, the specific ways your fear of failure disguises itself in everyday life. The seduction of productive procrastination. The most dangerous form of resistance is not obvious distraction like video games or television. It is productive procrastination. This occurs when you spend massive amounts of time and energy on high-effort, low-stakes tasks that create the illusion of progress without exposing your abilities to any real judgment. Consider how this plays out across different ambitions. The aspiring creator spends 3 weeks researching the best camera lenses, setting up custom workspace lighting, designing a channel banner, and color-coding project folders, but avoids recording a single raw, unscripted video where their speaking ability might be judged. The entrepreneur spends months perfecting a legal structure, drafting complex business cards, tweaking website color palettes, and organizing spreadsheets, while avoiding the single terrifying phone call required to pitch a real client for money. The writer reads 4 books on story structure, builds endless character backstories, and buys specialized writing software, but refuses to sit down and write the first messy, imperfect scene. In every instance, the individual feels exhausted at the end of the day. They tell their friends and family that they are working tirelessly on their dreams. In truth, their brain has pulled off a brilliant defensive trade. It substituted the safe sensation of motion for the dangerous reality of execution. As long as you remain in the preparation phase, your work cannot be criticized, your ideas cannot be rejected, and your fragile self-image remains completely safe. The somatic freeze and sudden fatigue. Have you ever noticed that you can feel energetic and clear-headed all morning, but the exact moment you sit down to work on your most important project, an overwhelming wave of physical exhaustion hits you? Your eyelids feel heavy, your jaw tightens, your brain feels like it is moving through wet cement, and you suddenly feel desperate for a nap. This is not physical tiredness. It is a somatic shutdown. Under the framework of polyvagal theory, when your nervous system detects a threat that it feels it cannot fight or escape, it drops into a primitive survival state known as the dorsal vagal freeze. In the animal kingdom, when a creature realizes it cannot outrun a predator, it plays dead. Its heart rate drops, its body temperature cools, and its nervous system numbs itself to minimize pain. When you face a high-stakes task that threatens your self-worth, your subconscious treats the blank page or the difficult phone call as that predator. Because you cannot physically run away from your own goals without feeling like a failure, your body chooses the only other biological escape route available. It pulls the emergency brake on your energy levels. It numbs your focus and induces artificial drowsiness to force you away from the keyboard and back to the safety of bed. The perpetual preparation trap. Another common manifestation of failure phobia is the compulsive belief that you need just one more qualification before you can finally begin. You tell yourself that you cannot launch your service until you finish another certification course. You cannot write your essay until you read 6 more research papers. You cannot speak up in meetings until you have analyzed every historical case study. This is the perpetual preparation trap. It is imposter syndrome, weaponized as an avoidance strategy. It allows you to stay in the comfortable identity of a student, where expectations are low and guidance is provided. It exempts you from the terrifying expectations placed on practitioners, where you must deliver real results without a safety net. It turns learning, which is normally a healthy, constructive habit, into a psychological fortress that keeps you locked away from practical application. The hard truth is that more information rarely cures hesitation. You do not lack knowledge. You lack the emotional safety required to be a clumsy beginner in public. The micro-distraction emergency loop. The final symptom in the matrix is the sudden emergence of trivial emergencies. The moment you sit down to write a difficult proposal, your brain suddenly alerts you that the kitchen counter has a smudge on it. As soon as you open your financial records, you suddenly remember an email you forgot to reply to 3 days ago. When you try to practice a difficult instrument, you suddenly feel an urgent need to reorganize your bookshelf. Your brain elevates these trivial chores into urgent life-or-death priorities because they provide a quick, guaranteed hit of accomplishment without any emotional stakes. Cleaning a counter carries zero risk of failure. Answering routine emails requires no vulnerability. Organizing files provides immediate order and control. By constantly putting out these low-stakes microfires, you stay trapped in a reactive loop. You feel perpetually busy, constantly stressed and endlessly behind, while the one needle-moving task that could actually transform your life sits untouched in the dark.